What are cigarette cards? What are T206 cards? Who's still smoking cigarettes? We're going to talk about that. When you think about T206 baseball cards or cigarette cards or the history of cigarette cards in general, it's crazy to think where we are now in the 21st century. This sports cards hobby has gotten pretty crazy 1 century later. So we're going to look back, look at the T206 card world, try to understand it a little bit better, and discuss the history before we talk about the current T206 climate and what my most recent T206 purchase was. It's my only T206, but I'm going to show that at the end. An awesome card that I got. Hall of Famer too, but we'll talk about it at the end. But first, sports cards are a multi-billion-dollar industry now. But for the first half of the 20th century, it's hard to believe that cards were free. Well, they were free technically because they were given out as bonuses in packs of cigarettes. It's meant to entice the cigarette smoker a little more so the kids can bug them to buy a certain brand over another brand. So the kids would bug them until I want this card, I want these cards. So the cigarette smoker would then buy packs of cards or packs of cigarettes from this brand specifically. Cigarette cards were also meant to help the structure of the pack. They weren't just for funsies. They actually did provide some support. They were a little thicker than a lot of the card stock we see now, and they provided some support for that pack of cards so that these cigarettes didn't get all crinkled and damaged and gross. So now let's look back at the history of cigarette cards. The history of cigarette cards goes back all the way back to the late 1800s. Really, with tobacco brands like Allen & Ginter, Goodwin and Company, they were inserting cards into cigarette packs as a marketing gimmick, like I mentioned before for the T206. Now, these were cigarette cards we're talking about now, not yet T206s. We'll get to those in a second. But in 1890, several U.S. tobacco manufacturers merged under James Buck Duke's headship into becoming the American Tobacco Company. Now, since companies like Allen & Ginter and Kinney Brothers and Goodwin and Company, since they no longer competed against each other because they were all part of this ATC, the American Tobacco Company, that meant they didn't need these marketing ploys like trading cards jammed into a pack. They didn't need that anymore. It was no longer necessary because you're going to buy from them no matter what if you're a cigarette smoker. So this monopoly, which it really was, it meant that anyone who wanted to buy cigarettes would already be buying them from the American Tobacco Company. So it didn't matter. Now, fast forward about 20 years into the 20th century, the early 20th century, and just like when your brother would get mad and flip the board over when he was done playing games with you, it was time for the monopoly to finally end in 1911. But not before the American Tobacco Company took full advantage once again. Now, they saw the writing on the wall. They knew that the American justice system was coming down on this monopoly pretty soon. So Buck Duke, the founder of the ATC, started some of the same marketing concepts he had used 20 years earlier by putting baseball cards into boxes of cigarettes. We now know those as T206 baseball cards. Now, the naming of which we'll get into later, but these cards were the newer, better versions of the cards that were produced about 20 years earlier by other brands. Different players, obviously, but in other words, it was the same concept, just a different manufacturer, a different brand. T206 baseball cards were issued from 1909 to 1911 in 16 different tobacco brands. Now, the most famous ones is 1909 to 1911, the white border cards. Those are T206 cards. Without a monopoly in hand, about 500 baseball cards were produced to, again, battle for the hearts and the lungs of tobacco users. Among this set is the iconic T206 Honus Wagner baseball card. It's the most famous baseball card that's ever been produced. 16 different brands under the ATC umbrella created these T206 cards. And you can check them out on eBay. You can go now and go look at some T206 cards from 1909 to 1911. Now, there was also 1909 to 1911 T206 Piedmont backs. More than half of those white bordered T206 cards that went into circulation have Piedmont backs. The one I have that I'm going to show you in a little bit with a Hall of Famer has a Piedmont back. This happens to be the cheapest entry point for collectors looking to start collecting T206 cards right now. Now, like I said, I was able to find a T206 Piedmont card myself with an SGC 1 grade, mind you. And I got that for less than $100 on eBay. So you can buy into these cards. You know, think about all the modern cards that people are spending crazy money for because they're parallels and they're this color and they've got the disco Frankenstein. Think about all the craziness. Or you can buy a card that's over 100 years old, over 110 years old, that's seen 100 years of history. You can buy that graded for less than $100 on eBay. That's pretty awesome. So in 1911, the United States versus the American Tobacco Company was a fight in court that proved fatal for the cigarette monopoly. And that brought an end to cigarette cards as we know them. Now, let's go back to that T206 Honus Wagner baseball card. While many of those T206 baseball cards are considered valuable, even the one I have, it's the T206 Honus Wagner that has gained the most fame. That's the one everyone knows about. Even non-card collectors know about this card. As most seasoned card collectors know, the scarcity and condition of a card is what often drives the value of it. Wagner's card happens to be one of the most scarce cards in sports card history. Now, the reason that card was so scarce, it's kind of debatable. Some people say it's because Wagner didn't want his cards produced because he didn't want kids to buy cigarettes, so he didn't want a cigarette company manufacturing his cards. Another plausible reason that was been debated is Wagner wanted more compensation from American Tobacco Company for the use of his face, his likeness, his picture, his image. He was a superstar at the time. Maybe, that makes sense, right? So Wagner is still considered one of the greatest baseball players of all time, and we're over 100 years past when he last picked up a glove. That's how good he was. The 1976 Topps All-Time All-Stars subset chose Honus Wagner as its shortstop representative on that team. In other words, 50 years ago, they picked Honus Wagner as the greatest shortstop of all time. That's pretty cool. It's believed that there are between 50 and 200 T206 Honus Wagner cards out there distributed to the public before he put a stop to it. The most famous version of this card is called the Gretzky T206 Honus Wagner. Now, that's because it was once owned by Wayne Gretzky. You could probably pick up on that. The greatest hockey player of all time owned a T206 Honus Wagner card. The Great One purchased it in 1991 along with LA Kings owner Bruce McNally. He had just gotten traded to the Kings a year or two prior, and they went in on this one together as an investment. They paid $451,000 for this card. Then a few years later, Gretzky and McNall sold the card for $500,000 to Walmart. What? Walmart? How the... Who... What the... Actually, what it was a top prize in a promotional contest that they were running. So they bought the card to give away in a prize. And a postal worker from Florida ended up winning it, and he in turn flipped it, auctioned it off for $640,000 in 1996. Then in 2000, a couple years later, it sold again for $1.27 million. It doubled in price by the year 2000. That's pretty amazing. Then it sold once again in 2007 for $2.35 million, almost doubled again. And then finally it sold again in 2011 to Arizona Diamondbacks owner Ken Kendrick for $2.8 million. That's in 2011. And it hasn't sold again since. He's holding on to it. I bet you he keeps it in his pocket everywhere he goes. Probably not. So while other T206 Honus Wagner cards have sold for more money since then, as have several other cards. There's been a lot of cards that have sold for more than that, including 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle cards and 2009 Bowman Chrome Draft Prospects Mike Trout Superfractor card. There's been other cards that have sold for more, but it doesn't take away that, without question, the T206 Honus Wagner card is still considered the greatest baseball card of all time because of its history, its scarcity, and his ability on the field. Now, what's interesting is one of those T206 Honus Wagner card owners, Bill Mastro, famously pled guilty to trimming the Gretzky T206 card. Can you imagine that? He trimmed it before he sold it to the person who ended up selling it to Gretzky and McNall. There's actually a fantastic book that came out about this card called The Card: Collectors, Conmen, and the True Story of History's Most Desired Baseball Card. Fantastic read. This was Michael O'Keefe wrote it. Fantastic read. However, this was written in 2007, and a lot of stuff has happened to this card since. So it's good to read the book. It's interesting, but you can then catch up on what happened since then after that. There are several famous T206 Honus Wagner baseball cards, but the Gretzky owned one, the one that this book is about, that's still the most renowned baseball card ever. So why were these cigarette cards named T206 baseball cards? Well, there's no really mysterious code to break. It's not really anything super secret. They're named T206 baseball cards really because that's what one guy decided. They weren't even referred to as T206 cards until 1937. Jefferson Burdick, who's considered basically one of the greatest card collectors in history. He's kind of considered the grandfather of sports card collecting. He cataloged hundreds of thousands of cards so future collectors could understand the origination of these cards. So the T in T206 stands for, can you guess? T stands for tobacco. It's for tobacco cards, but it's specifically for American tobacco cards from the 20th century. So that's a major distinction because an N, a card that starts, a cataloged card that starts with an N, that stands for 19th century tobacco cards. Or a card that starts with C, that is designated for Canadian tobacco cards. So the T, remember, stands for tobacco, but it's American tobacco from the 20th century. Those two things, American and 20th, that's what it stands for, T206. Now, the 206 designation was just for cards that were created in that period from 1909 to 1911 by the American Tobacco Company. The T205 cards were gold border cards, also from the American Tobacco Company, but they were printed in 1911. And then there's T207 cards that were brown background cards that were created in or manufactured in 1912. So why is the T206 card set called the Monster? Well, since this set rolls over the course of 3 years, 1909 to 1911, there are over 500 cards. Some say 524 different cards to collect, with some players appearing in more than one card in different poses, with as many as 40 different card back options. Then the backs are ads for different cigarette brands under the American Tobacco Company umbrella, including some of the most famous brands, like I mentioned before, Piedmont, Sweet Caporral, and Polar Bear. It wouldn't be until the 21st century rolled around until we saw new versions of the T206 cigarette cards, as Topps rebooted the brand in 2002. Now, these weren't cigarette cards, but they were similar in that they had similar designs from that early 20th century white border tobacco card, and they had active players, though, instead of players from 1909. Does that make sense? I had purchased a 2002. I was a local card shop in 2003, and I had purchased a 2002 Topps T206 Albert Pujols Bat Relic card. And it was awesome. I recently sold it, but it was a cool card. I was really happy. I got that grade. I think I got a PSA 9 on that. Very happy with that. Now, most recently, you could buy 2024 Topps 206 baseball cards. They're not cigarette cards, online at Topps.com. So they'll do those as online exclusives every now and then. You can buy cards on there. So that's all we got for cigarette cards. I thought that was an interesting history I thought you'd enjoy. And now let's look at the card that I got, and I'll explain why I got this one, what I was looking for, and what I was trying to do with it. All right, let's get into this. Now, first, I want to explain what my qualifications for what card I would get to represent my 1909 T206 set. This is the only card I'm probably ever going to buy for T206. Why was it this one? So first, had to be a 1909. I wanted the oldest of the T206s in my collection. And I like that it was Piedmont. That's the most famous one. It was the most common one. I like that. I also wanted it graded more than authentic. So this is a better than a card, better than an authentic card. It's a, SGC 1. I also wanted it in an SGC tuxedo because they just look so darn good for vintage cards. And SGC is noted for their vintage grading. So an SGC 1 is pretty much guaranteed to be PSA 1 or better on any other companies. SGC 1 is a good thing. Now, I also chose this one. I wanted to get a Hall of Famer. I wanted to make sure the player I got that represented this set was a player in the MLB Baseball Hall of Fame. I love that it's Fred Clark holding bat. I love that. I also wanted the picture to be one that looked like a player, like someone from the early 1900s. Look at that ball cap. He's definitely a 1900s kind of guy. And I love that the picture itself, like the photo inside or the drawing or painting or whatever it is inside, is colorful and clear and pretty. It looks good. The corners are certainly rounded. It's a little centered to the right, but you can read F. Clark, Pittsburgh. They didn't get the H yet. They hadn't heard that there's an H in Pittsburgh yet. That came later. See the G ending in they found out about the H later. Meanwhile, my favorite, this is the card I wanted to get. I wanted it to be under $100. And this was Fred Clark. We'll talk about him in a second. But he had a 68 WAR. Like, this was a legit baseball Hall of Famer. Now on the back, you can see like somebody scribbled on here. I couldn't really figure out what they scribbled. SF maybe here, maybe somebody's initial. But 150 subjects for this Piedmont set. But like I said, over 500 over the 3 years from the T206s. Now, like the little schmutz, I'd like to think that that's just some tobacco. Some tobacco stuck to the card. That's how I like to think of it. Rather than there's some dog poop or something. I'd rather think it's some tobacco. That's what I say. Now, let's talk about Fred Clark for a second. As I mentioned, he's a Hall of Famer. He was a very good player and ended up becoming a very good manager. He played with the Louisville Colonels until they folded. What's interesting is when they did fold, the Fred Clark and a few of his teammates got pulled into the Pittsburgh Pirates. Now, they show the transaction on Baseball Reference as a trade, but in that trade, the Pirates got Fred Clark and Honus Wagner, considered one of the greatest all-stars shortstops of all time. One of the greatest. So Honus Wagner and Fred Clark together, that's a pretty good combination. They would end up beating the Detroit Tigers in the 1909 World Series. And Clark hit over 311 different seasons. He had a 35-game hitting streak. He had the Major League record for wins by a manager at one point, and got inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1945 by the Old Timers Committee. So something I wanted to mention, a couple random things here. So this fella, he's playing baseball in 1909. He started his career earlier than that, obviously, in 1894. It was his MLB debut. But what's interesting here is this is a guy that was born in 1872. I'm holding a card of a player that was born in 1872. That's just after the Civil War, for goodness sakes. He played for the Louisville Colonels. And it was interesting too, like just to know what a tough guy he is. He comes from Winterset, Iowa, okay? His family moved to Iowa, or from Iowa to Kansas, in a covered wagon caravan. Can you imagine that? He was in a wagon, this guy. Anyways, let's move on. I thought this was interesting too. This is how tough he was. When he, later on in his life, we're talking about in the 40s now, late 40s, he and his wife were fishing in northern Minnesota, and they fell through the ice into the icy waters of Minnesota. And they were rescued, they survived, only to end up being accidentally shot while quail hunting. Not too long after that. Not too long after that, he was in a gas furnace explosion in his basement, and he survived that. This guy ended up outliving pretty much everybody. Lived to 87, age 87. He died in the year 1960. But tell me this isn't a guy that's just a tough, hard-nosed son of a gun you want on your baseball card team, right? Fred Clark, Hall of Famer, Pittsburgh Pirates. What else can I say about this guy? Like I said, he was a manager. He was one of the best managers. He's a World Series champion. He's in the Pittsburgh Pirates Hall of Fame. He was great. I was a big fan. I always loved me some. When I was a kid, I remember thinking Fred Clark. I wore his jersey. Okay, all of that's a lie, but still, awesome card. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed a little history lesson on the T206, Piedmont, cigarette cards, all that good stuff. Let me know. Are you going to go out and get a cigarette card, the T206s? I think you should. You can get them under $100 graded. This is a Hall of Famer. Don't spend your money on a stinking, quadroplex disco happening parallel numbered to 399. Don't spend $100 on that. Buy some piece of history like this. Get this in your collection. That's pretty awesome. Look, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You do what you want to do. But let me just tell you this. Whatever you do, make sure you have a happy hobby.